ago when Scott did a demo, and we were thinking maybe it was 4 years ago. Feels like forever. So yeah, I'm Rebecca. Scott and I own Eastside Pot Shop in East Austin. I see a couple of our people here. And we also have a collaborative ceramics practice, looks a little bit like this and like this, called Nom Ceramics. It's all cone 10 soda-fired wares, mostly functional. And we do a lot of layering of underglazes, flashing slips, and other glazes on top. I'll talk a little bit about that tonight. I am a hand builder, Scott's the thrower, so we kind of combine forms to make a body of work that ebbs and flows between sculptural and functional. It's really fun, right? Cool. So tonight I am going to show how I make my round vessels. It's a coil and pinch technique that I kind of adapted from other demos I've seen, and over time have come up with this process that kind of leads to an almost spherical form without using a template, and just mostly using your fingers and a few ribs. So first I will talk about the clay that I use. I kind of switch back and forth between B-mix, cone 10 B-mix, and a stoneware that we make at our shop called Fig Newman, that's what we call it. Armadillo makes it for us. It's a recipe we developed that kind of lends itself to the soda firing process. It kind of flashes really beautifully and on its own becomes a really beautiful surface. More recently, in the past year or so, I've been exploring underglazes and wanting to get more colorful surfaces. So I started using B-mix, and that kind of opened up a whole new world of underglazes and flashing slips and being able to layer a lot more. So first I'm going to talk about building the form, and then I'll get into a little bit of the surface decoration. Sound good? Cool. And at any point, if you want to come closer, there are some moments where if you're like really interested in recreating this form or this process, please feel free to get up in here. And as always, you can ask questions throughout the demo. It's helpful to have a little discussion going, I think. So in the B-mix, I like to wedge what's called mica. We got this from a company called Pacer, right? Through Armadillo. It's a whole story. It's kind of hard to get this stuff, but actually one of my students just ordered some on Amazon. It came in bigger flakes, but you can see this is more like a fine, almost like a super fine grog. And it starts, mica is in a lot of different things like makeup and other materials. It's really glittery in its sort of raw form like this. And when it melts, you can kind of see in this image, there's some little black sort of specks. The glaze kind of takes it with it, and it melts at cone 10. So anyway, these are a little bit, it gets a little bit lost in those surfaces, but it also acts as a nice grog to build with. So it's one reason I added it. So,
just using as a surface decoration.
Yes, I see it as a surface decoration. Just like another element of getting some added depth to the surfaces. So it kind of like the glaze, it'll peek through the glazes. At this, if you look at this one closely, you can see it's just like a glitter. But like I said, at cone 10, it'll melt and come through the glazes and just creates a whole other, aspect. So I'll just show you kind of how I add it to the clay, and then I'm gonna have Scott take it over there and wedge it. But I have some, if that's okay. So has anyone worked with B-mix? I'm sure plenty of us have. We know that it's gotta be thrown around a little bit before we can actually work with it. Out of the bag, it's really stiff. So if you're ever in a studio, you see people throwing around a bag of clay, that's why. I tend to not wedge a whole bunch of clay at once, just to, for the sake of my hands. So this is about the max that I usually wedge. So that's what I'll prep for Scott. But I make a crater in the middle there and just kind of eyeball how much mica I like to add. And then after I've wedged it, I'll kind of like pull my thumb back and I can see these black specks. And that's how I decide how much I like. My whole practice is kind of just eyeballing everything. Some people would weigh it out. I get that too. But thank you.
We all need one of those.
Yeah.
For hire.
So I already have some wedged, but I'm gonna take this up to water. Yeah, right. We can elaborate. He wedges my clay for me. But it is nice. We both go back and forth between the two clay bodies, so we can kind of wedge a bunch at a time and share. I do tend to add a lot more mica than he does. To each their own. So, the main tools that I use are ribs. I love a good metal rib, a serrated rib, and I like the green one with this right angle here. I think that's pretty crucial for a lot of different forms. And of course the curved edges are nice. I use vinegar as a slip/glue. And of course a needle tool and a knife. And a banding wheel. That's pretty much it for me. Is anyone in here a coil builder primarily? Yay! A couple of hands, mostly throwers. Well, thanks for coming to see me. I won't be using a wheel tonight. So I really love using the bat that matches the banding wheel head, just to kind of help everything get centered. For so long, I was avoiding making round forms, just because, when I was learning, I thought I might as well just throw a round form, right? But in the end, hand-built forms that are round look way different than a thrown round form. I really love that kind of organic side of it that I get. So that's why I don't use a template. All my round shapes, of course, have little flat spots. They're not perfect spheres, and that's okay for me. But you could use a template if you'd like. So I put 3 little dabs of clay there and then squish my wear board down. Kind of helps keep everything in place. And then it's kind of automatically centered on there. Since I'm working in the round, I do kind of try to keep it on center. Otherwise it gets a little out of control. So like for a big one like this, I would, okay, hold on, let me go back. So for this form, I start from the widest part rather than starting from the bottom and building out and then back in. I start from the widest part and build in, and then I'll flip it and do that also. So, with coiling and throwing, that the clay is always gonna wanna go out, right? And in the beginning with coil building, that's like the biggest thing we see is forms just get kind of crazy. So this way, everything kind of stays controlled and you're not like fighting gravity in that sense. Thank you. Okay. So for my space, I kind of like to have my banding wheel to the left and a coil rolling station here. Although, as I'm sure many of you know, that space kind of gets a lot smaller and smaller as we go. So I'm gonna build one that's about like a 7-inch diameter. For a larger one, I would just use this outer rim of the bat as the diameter. And I kind of roll my coils as I go. So I'm just gonna kind of eyeball 7 inches on this banding wheel, find the middle point, and then just using water, I'll draw a line of water where my coil is gonna stick to. So I try to get it pretty wet. And again, since this bat fits the wheel head, it's pretty much a perfect circle, right? And I'll start kind of with a thicker coil than I normally build with. And starting at 12 o'clock, I'll just pinch this around, following kind of the inside of that line. And I'm just like pinching and pushing as I go. And then for this first coil, I really want to get it stuck down to the bat, because it's kind of the whole foundation. And so when I flip it, you'll see it looks super crazy, but we'll clean it up. Then I kind of go back and clean up this outside edge, clean up the inside edge. And kind of try to get this back. Okay, so now I'll check to see where I'm really at. Yeah, about 7. So the whole thing is, with this first half, which is what becomes the bottom of the vessel, since it's 7 wide, I'm gonna aim for about 3.5 height. So the whole time I'm gonna be building inward and try not to go taller than that. That's kind of the whole thing. Even if it's not perfect, visually we kind of tricks our eyes to think of it as a perfect sphere when it's the same, you know. So for this first coil, it's really important to start this direction of going inward. So I kind of like take the green rib at an angle and really get it started. It's pretty sharp at first, but this will help me not go straight up or out. And so the whole time I'm building, it's all about working inward. Does that make sense? And you'll see that this happens pretty quickly. That's why I didn't go any smaller than this, because it would only take a few coils.
How particular are you about your coils being even?
That's what I was just gonna ask.
I think I don't think about it too much, but they are all about this thickness. You mean in thickness?
Or like if you have like little sausages, you know, they get
Yeah.
thick, it's like.
If I get a really thin spot, I'll kind of break it and then reattach it and just re-roll that spot, you know. But I don't obsess about it too much, because since I call this a coil and pinch method, everything gets so like wedged together almost, that as long as it's not severely super thin in one spot, then it should be okay. So for the second coil, I go right on the inside. I'm touching the bat this time, and everything's gonna overlap. So it's like, I like to use the analogy of shingles on a roof. It's like everything kind of follows the same curve and is embedded. So the coils are always overlapping on the inside edge. And then this is where the pinching part comes in. So before adding the next coil, I spend a good amount of time pinching. And so this gets, you know, we grow in height, we thin it out, and we compress it a lot. It's kind of the whole thing. I start with my thumb on the inside, then move to the outside. And again, I'm really thinking about, you know, pushing the clay inward. Whether or not it's rounded yet, it's still going inward.
Do you have a finishing thickness you're going for?
It's usually pretty thin. So this top edge is kind of how thick it is.
Okay.
I don't think about it too much though.
Well, because I was thinking, like, you know, when you throw something into a cone shape, you get more mass at the bottom so the top doesn't collapse.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so wasn't sure if that
Yeah, I
bottom
don't think,
edge is.
yeah, I don't, no, I don't.
I'm thinking too
consider
much,
that.
never mind.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good thing to bring up, because,
Because
you
this
know,
is a small sphere, but if you're a really big sphere, does it try to collapse on itself?
you know, I think, especially with this clay body, I don't find that happens. With how it's all integrated, and I guess the bigger it is, the slower I'm moving. So by the time I'm like here, you know, if it's really flopping, which doesn't really happen because I take kind of a while to get there, then use a torch and, you know, firm it up a little bit.
Mhm.
But since there's so much compression happening in that pinch, I find that it doesn't flop around too much. A lot less than if I was building like that. You know, if it was this big wide opening.
And does it make a difference if you're building it without the mica in it? Like this, because you said it gave it some grogness.
It doesn't make that big of a difference.
Okay, just curious.
Yeah, it's a good question. The mica is so fine that, I don't know, I like to think that it does. I don't think it makes that big of a difference. Do you? With throwing with it? Throws with it also.
A little bit, you know, but it's nice because it's not like grog where you're actually feeling the texture. It's way smoother. So I think it probably also helps on some minute level the less shrinkage. You know,
Yeah,
shrinks a little less, maybe a little stronger.
yeah. Okay, so now I've got kind of a severe angle, but this is good because in the beginning, if we're thinking too much about the round shape, then things kind of tend to go vertical or the other way around. So just like with throwing, I guess, when you want to go straight up, you kind of go inward. So I kind of just do what feels right with my hand, and then I'm going to come back and sweep it out a bit. So now I'm going to add the coil just to the inner top edge. And I'm kind of like rolling it down. But again, it's overlapping on the inside edge. And with these round shapes, I always pinch off. I don't really do another level of coil before kind of pinching and getting it where I want to be. So I'll oftentimes come down on eye level and kind of see how the profile of the form is looking. Right now I'm trying to get a little bit more height so that I can start shaping it a bit.
Do you
trying-
make bowls like this?
Hmm?
Do you make bowls?
I do. Yeah, it's a great way to make bowls. Like big mixing bowls, you know, starting with or even small ones.
So you do them upside down?
Mm-hmm. It's just and I also build them the other way, but it's just kind of a different look, you know. I think I can get rounder shapes this way. So now I kind of go in with my thumb and watching the perimeter here, I'm kind of trying to fill in a little bit of this bottom edge to get it a hair rounder. So just filled it in a tad. And then I'll come back and push that top edge back in.
Do you ever go and cut it level?
Not till I get closer to like the to the top.
And can you talk a little bit about why you're not scoring at all?
Yeah, so I rarely score. I do when I attach like a slab or a coil to a slab. I'll score if I, you know, take a break and then come back and the top edge is leather hard. But with this wedging the coils together, everything is so integrated that scoring and adding slip just like brings more moisture in and takes more time. And I used to score between every coil a long time ago, but I just realized that I don't really have to. I really never get cracks between. I'll show you the times that I do score, and it's that I do take scoring seriously. It's just between the coils, I think that they get so compressed that it's okay. The other thing is like, yeah, compression is the whole thing. So even when I wrap the coil around, the end where the coil meets is gonna overlap. So, you know, everything is kind of connected. And I kind of use my left hand as like a paddle almost, just to kind of try to keep the whole direction of the form moving inward before switching to a rib. And you can see it's just a very repetitive process. Coil, coil, pinch, pinch. Kind of moving between the two, or the check. So I'm getting there. It happens pretty quickly, and you kind of reach like the crux of the curve and then have to force yourself to really work almost like horizontally. So I'm almost there.
So you're just using math, right? You're aiming for 3.5?
Yeah, I'm kind of, yeah. So, you know. It's really easy to go too tall in that sense. So that's kind of why I use the ruler, just to keep myself from going too tall versus the diameter that I went with, you know? So it kind of keeps it under control. Otherwise, you know, before I know it, it'll be like up here and it's a big oval.
So I have a question. These are like actual real questions because I don't like actually watch her make these things out.
We're not just plugging the audience.
I'm really actually
It's
curious.
helpful and that's good.
Are the big ones thicker than the small ones, or do you think
No, I
both-
don't think so.
They come about the same?
Yeah, I think they are about the same. And so, yeah, this process, one thing I do notice, and I try to let it go, is that they are a little heavier than like maybe a fine potter would want. But coming from a sculpture background, you know, I really am trying to let that go. For a while, that got really important to me, and I would like scrape the surface until it was feather light. And then as I am getting older, I guess, I don't know, I'm realizing that that's some old wise man's thing that doesn't really concern me anymore. I mean, it's not like we're gonna be picking these up and looking in them or something. And it's not like they're bricks, but they're maybe heavier than a wheel thrown one would be. But for, you know, functional things that we pick up every day, that's something I do think about. Okay, so now I'm kind of like really making sure that I'm moving inward, almost forcing the clay like on top of itself. And I am just gonna kind of double this up and get my hand in here and almost sometimes feel like you're making like a flat top to it. And of course, you know, for the sake of the demo, I'm doing this a lot faster than I normally do. But without a lot of effort, you can make a pretty round form with this process.
Have you ever had it come off the bat?
No, I haven't. On accident, you mean?
Well, like if you make it over the course of like 3 days, does it?
I
'cause
did,
It seems
yeah.
like if it comes off, you'd be screwed.
Yeah, this stuff, like MDF, I guess, it's pretty good. I've done it on the sheetrock board and it wasn't as, yeah, it kind of dried up down there. So that brings up a good point. You know, once we close this and kind of decide that we're happy with the shape, you know, I probably would spend some time kind of with my hand in here, like filling out the curve a bit, just to kind of really go for that roundness. But once we close this in, it has to set up quite a bit. So I brought one that's leather hard, but for the bigger forms, like that one, I built half of it at Penland, and then like almost a week later, I flipped it and did the other half. So it sets up quite a bit like a dry leather hard. And I'll show you about connecting it and everything. But so the challenge is keeping this connection point moist enough, you know, and it's kind of hard to do. I would just like squeeze a sponge around it every other day. So now I'm just trying to kind of lift this top bit up, and then I'll check how close I'm getting. The opening's getting pretty small. Yeah, so I have like a 1/4 inch to go, so I'm gonna add one more coil. And one thing I like to do is add a little bit of a lift before I close it in, just to kind of, you know, if it doesn't have this subtle curve here, it kind of feels slumped a bit on the table, you know? So that's something I've kind of started doing over time. So in that sense, it might get just a hair taller.
So do you stick to spheres mostly, or would you try to go forms?
So I used to build mostly, you know, non-even forms, non-symmetrical forms. But it's funny, you know, Scott and I, the past year, we bought a house and had a lot of just so much going on that all I could think to make was round pots. I could not think of anything else. So that's really what I have been focusing on, I feel like, for the past year, maybe year and a half. I'm thinking I'll get out of it soon, but it's been really fun. They're fun surfaces, and you know, for our firing process, kind of having this big round, I like to think of it like a big shoulder area to glaze and catch soda, and sometimes we would fire at Eye of the Dog. Is kind of a beautiful canvas for that.
Rebecca, what's your preferred scale? Do you like to work small or like you really like
Yeah.
big?
I really like this size here for these round vessels. But recently I have been doing a handful of smaller ones. They also feel more, you know, accessible and less complicated. But like I said, we just bought a house, we got a studio at home, and so I do hope to push scale a little bit in the coming future. I do dream of making large sculptures, but I kind of picture them being, you know, different pieces, maybe not just one thing, but things stacking, or so maybe something like this with things stacking out of it, kind of growing in scale, not just in one object.
I mean, is there a certain part, we were talking at dinner about, kind of Bob was, and a couple of us at the end of the table were like, once you get so much stuff at your house, you gotta sell it or do something. So like, does scale, you know, does making the choices of scale somehow interact with selling?
Yeah, definitely.
Or like, you know, it's like, how do you sell these big things all the
Yeah.
time, or, you know, so.
I kind of like the idea of having, and this takes a lot of bandwidth, but having a practice that's, you know, functional and gets into people's homes really easily, and then having a separate practice that's bigger sculptures, and, you know, but it's hard to balance with everything.
So how big is the hole now? Like
So
a
now it's
dollar?
really small. Yeah,
Like a
so now
dollar?
the hole is about 1.5 inches. So, and I'm gonna, yeah, so, oops, I'm upside down. So, yeah, so I'm about there. So now I'm gonna open it up a little bit using a needle tool, because that's too small of a foot, right? So this is kind of the smallest I would like to go, which is about 2.25. So I'm just gonna kind of open it up by spinning, steadying the needle tool, kind of finding a size that makes sense. I always like to draw the line before I cut, so now I'll just trace that, cut it out. Okay. And so, yeah, sometimes I get lucky and these line right up. And this one usually for the big one, I don't know how that happens, but otherwise I would make a separate slab for it. But first I'll add that little lift in the bottom of the foot. So I'm just gonna roll a pretty skinny coil. And like I said, usually I would let this set up quite a bit before, like to the point where it doesn't really wanna smush at all, but it's pretty solid. I guess that is like a physics thing where the curve is like that and it doesn't wanna move as much. It's supporting itself pretty well. So I'm gonna kind of add this coil, it's still overlapping, but I'm kind of putting it toward the top edge. So I do, in the beginning with coil building, I kind of just thought about it as like slapping coils together and then blending it and then kind of shaping it. But as I build, every single coil is really important, Every little ½ inch of height that I gain is kind of crucial to the whole form. So before I go and add another one, I'll make sure that at least the direction is going where I want, So now that I have this coil, I can see that this is gonna turn into the little foot. So it's pretty much blended on the inside. Now I just kind of delicately blend it on the outside edge. And one thing I should note, since, obviously we're really obsessed with glaze, I don't spend too much time smoothing out all of these little imperfections. In the end, I kind of like studying the surfaces and like noticing those little spots. But of course, if I wanted to, I would use like a red rib or maybe a damp sponge and really get in there and smooth that out. So now I'll kind of spend a little bit of time, because it gets small again there, just flaring this out a little bit. And yeah, so this would be kind of a nice bowl shape. So I'm blending that inner seam, making sure everything's good. And then I'm just gonna go back, and this is where I'll trim, kind of lift this bottom a bit, but this is where I'll trim it to level, which of course isn't ever super perfect, but that's the way I roll. So, okay, and that's for now I'm gonna attach a slab there, which would be just about the same size as this one. So I'm gonna pound this slab out on the sheet rock so that I don't stick to the wood. I've never rolled coils on a wood table before.
I was wondering how you feel about that.
It's okay. I prefer, it's a little sticky, yeah. I do prefer canvas topped, but I think this has like some built up clay on it. So it's a little bit of a resistor. So I kind of just start with a ball of clay and pound it out. If it were a bigger slab, I'd use a rolling pin. Okay. So I like to have a little bit overlap. So this is a little small at this point, so I'm just gonna cut the big one.
How big is it?
Let's see. Quarter, 3/8. Yeah. And somehow magically it matches the thickness of this. Okay, so again, usually I'd let this set up to about leather hard, but it's holding its shape pretty well. So I'm just gonna kind of trace the outer edge here. And now I'll know where to cut this slab. Kind of follow the outside of that line. Okay. And then I'm gonna kind of pound the outer edge just to give it a little bevel. this score tool. Anybody else use one of these?
Yeah.
Have you ever stabbed yourself with it on accident?
Yeah, they're dangerous.
I did it at the counter at Armadillo, and it was pretty embarrassing. It was when they first showed up, and I was like, oops. Okay, so this is where I score, because I'm not gonna be able to really get in there to compress it. And I feel like since I pounded the slab out, I kind of compressed the clay particles in that way. So now it kind of all needs to be scored up and smushed together. That's the main verb for my practice, is smush. Vinegar is a good glue. Trying to put too much, but now I'm gonna just kind of follow that and squish it down. And I like to have a little overlapping here so that I can really make sure I got a good connection. It's a little wetter than I normally would do this, but it'll work. So I'm kind of just like pinching this outer edge down. And then eventually I get this air pocket in here, and it will stop slumping in any spot, you know, so it kind of resists the pressure. So when you get that closed in air pocket, you can really work on your form a lot. You can paddle or scrape it without it changing shape. I'm gonna kind of scrape off this extra.
What is it about vinegar?
My assumption is that the acidity kind of helps break down the clay particles, but also like vinegar is used, you know, as the opposite of a deflocculant, which I don't know. So I don't know, it's something with the acidity. Right, Scott, do you have a better answer?
I don't have a technical answer, but you know, like a lot of shops or a lot of people will just make a slip out of their clay. But we worked for a long time at our community pottery studio, and everybody's got a different clay, so we like couldn't make a different clay slip for each. And I noticeably can tell that the vinegar will make a mud as you score and add it faster than just the water itself. So, and it just smells lovely. And somehow with water, you'll never spill it, and with vinegar, you'll spill it every time.
Every time. Yeah. So I kind of paddle down that slab on around the seam, and then just kind of get this to a point where I'm happy with it. But it would take a bit of cleaning up, you know, spending some time with the metal rib before I'm happy with it. So that's pretty much it for the first half. The last kind of thing that I do is take the needle tool to the bottom edge here. And it's pretty round. I mean, of course I would have spent a little more time on that, but it's okay. So now I'll show you how I do the second half. Okay, cool, we're good on time. So this one I did yesterday and let it dry out, so it's pretty leather hard. And it's, the main thing is that since I'm gonna flip this over, like, it's really gotta be strong here or else it'll slump. And, you know, clay has a memory, so if it slumps now, it's gonna slump in the firing is kind of the whole thing. So kind of dragging this needle tool around the bottom edge to make an indentation before I go.
Talk a little bit about how you cover your items when you're trying to go for a leather part that's workable?
Yeah, so we're learning about it in our new studio. It's pretty humid. So it kind of depends, yeah, it depends on how, well, with this situation, like I had a deadline that I wanted it to be leather hard for, so I pretty much left it uncovered since our studio is really humid. But then you covered it back up. So I kind of do like a single, you covered it back up.
She told me to.
Because, yeah. That's how I meant to say it. He covered it back up because I was at work. I told him to keep an eye on it. So it was getting a little dry. So then he wrapped it, you know, he put plastic all the way around and under here to kind of stop the dryness, the drying of it. But, you know, if it's super wet, I would let it stay uncovered for a little while and then watch it if you can, if you have a space where you can keep an eye on it. If not, if you're working at a community studio and you need it leather hard for next week, I really would just wrap it up and not risk keeping anything unwrapped, you know, and just keep an eye on things. Thickness of plastic makes a huge difference. We like to use these trash bags, kitchen bags, but it's kind of depending on your space, right? The humidity level.
And the time of year for sure.
Yeah. So we're still figuring it out in our studio. Things are not drying very much. At the shop, definitely fluctuates throughout the year. Sometimes things are drying super fast. Okay, so I cut it. I went all the way through, and now I'm gonna flip it. And, you know, flipping it that way helps keep from shifting that round edge. So now you can see what I meant by how it looks kind of crazy when you flip it over. That edge looks super gnarly. That's just from smushing it into the back. So the first thing I do is go back and cut, because this is actually super thin, hairy stuff here. So I just kind of go back and cut it. And then I have about a 3/8 inch or a little thicker edge here. I want to keep a good thickness there. And then I'm going to go and score this bottom seam here and add a little coil. That's where we'll see some cracks if we don't tend to it. So I kind of like, it's pretty dry, so using quite a bit of pressure, I'll get in there and really score it up. You excited, Ginny? Ginny's gonna do this process. She's in our class. She had an idea and I was like, well, it's pretty much perfect for my demo for GACA. Okay, lots of vinegar down there in a little coil. Now I can, once I smooth this all in, you won't even really be able to see that flat bottom of the slab anymore. And I'll go back with the green rib. I gotta be careful that I'm not stretching it too much, because I can feel it moving a bit. Okay, so now it's pretty much smooth. Okay, so now I like to switch to the serrated rib to score up this whole edge, kind of on the top of it and the inside, since that's how I'm gonna lay the coil down. And basically, I'm gonna do the whole thing just using this as the new, you know, diameter template. So first I'll check how wide this is. This one's 7.5. So I'm gonna go 3 3/4, right? Tall? No, I'll just match it. I'll just go 7.5 tall. Because 3 3/4 is half of 7.5, right? Okay, no one's answering. I don't think y'all know either. Okay. But actually, yeah, all I have to think about is matching the height to the diameter. Wasn't a math person in school. Yeah. Well, when I first started making these forms, I was like, how do you find the height of a sphere? I was like, how do you figure that out? And then it just dawned on me that it's the same as the diameter. It's like, oh yeah. Okay.
Do you put a bevel on that?
It's a little bit, yeah. I kind of, just by holding the rib like that, it kind of rounds and bevels it. Okay, so now I score this guy like crazy. Okay, a bunch of vinegar. And then kind of on top and smushing toward the inside is how I'm laying this coil down. I almost think of it like an extension of the bottom half here. So I'm not thinking too much about moving inward, just kind of like setting up a good spot to add another coil, you know. So now I kind of blend it on the inside.
About how much overlap are you doing with your shingling?
Yeah, quite a bit. You can see how much it's blending on the inside, right? But kind of like a coil, half coil width, you know? Does that make sense? So depending on however thick your coils are. And since I can feel kind of the drier edge of this one, I do spend a good amount of time really trying to connect these two in order to avoid getting a crack here. Sometimes, especially if you're firing a cone 10, you know, you can go through bisque without a crack, and then out of the cone 10 firing, this whole thing will be an exposed seam, but it hasn't happened to me. I think, you know, if you let this get too dry, that's where you'll run into issues. But using the serrated rib to score it and again get these particles moved around really helps. So we never really want anything just to kind of like sit on top of itself. Everything is blended.
When you do get this whole form done, then do you let it like sit under plastic for a while?
Mhm.
Like bury?
Yeah, so then it'll kind of reacclimate. So I'll wrap the whole thing overnight, and then, you know, ideally by the next day it's better. Okay, so this is kind of a good spot to focus on, like, whether or not the first half was a perfect sphere. You know, the whole goal here is just to kind of match that curve. So I don't want to change the shape of the bottom half anymore because it's pretty dry now. But I really try to, using the rib, blend it super well. And this is gonna kind of bring the whole thing into vision, and it wobbles around a lot, but it's okay. So I kind of get in here with this. And a lot of times after bisque, like you can kind of see on this one where the connection point is. But after the glaze firing, it disappears. So with these round forms, it's a lot of like just watching this side edge as it spins. The other thing I think about is I try not to add the coil, like start the coil in the same place every time. Sometimes I feel like it'll start to like stretch out too much in that spot. So I try to switch it up if I can follow that. Sometimes you'll notice that like the edge will get a bit taller where you start or finish a coil. It's good to kind of move that around. So as I'm pushing, I'm kind of doing this motion, so pushing my thumb down and squeezing the clay up to get the height. Okay. And now I'm pulling it in with my hand. So it's interesting to kind of think about all the different parts of your fingers and your palm and how they each can kind of be used like a different tool, different molds. Serrated rib again. Okay. Sometimes I'll just kind of leave that serrated texture while I build.
So what led you to start doing the collaborative body work?
So it was really this glaze that Scott developed a long time ago. The glaze brought us together. So Scott used to do the glaze that we use for our line work. Do you want to tell, babe, how you developed it and
Yeah,
how you used to pour with it and stuff?
Yeah, so it's just like a really high feldspar, kind of almost like a variation of a chino, but it fully melts, but it doesn't move. So I really like textures, and I really love chinos my whole life, and I've had a cat named Chino, so I really wanted to work with these chino glazes, and then this glaze kind of came about, and so I would like pour layers of it on like cups, and it would build this really like 3/4 inch thickness of glaze coming off, and it did some cool stuff. And then one day she just like picked it up and was like, I can't draw worth a damn, so she can, and she came and just put it in this bottle and then just started drawing with it like a slip. So people always ask if we slip trail, but it's actually glaze. And so then, I did a lot of like sort of patterning work where she could do like a whole composition, like a painting on a piece. And we just found that between like our love for this glaze, our sort of dichotomy of throwing versus hand building, and the way that our imagery kind of complemented each other, that it made sense to create this body of work that encompassed all of it. And so that's how we started Nom. And then for a while it was like kind of cool because it was still now somewhat, but like one of us would start working on a piece or drawing on it, and then we get like tired of it, like just I'm over that piece, and then the other one would pick it up, and so that sort of really solidified the collaboration. So a lot of pieces like these are like full Rebecca. A lot of the thrown ones are full mine, and then there's these happy moments that are just like the real, like
Collabos.
yeah. So I feel like the whole thing's a collaboration, but some are just like literal collaborations. But yeah, that's kind of how it started.
The glaze.
And it's nice because like, I know in my own practice, like with the glaze, like the pouring the glazes and doing these things, my progression of like discovery was so slow, but then working around her, like it just made me discover, and then hopefully like vice versa. So like the progression of the work and like the way it evolved really was like at a pace like this, which was like super exciting, which then also solidified like the collaboration.
Yeah.
And so I guess we just haven't stopped. When we wood fire, we kind of still separate and do our own things because the wood fire is so rough on the pieces that this sort of line work and drawing can get lost. So that's our kind of time where we're like, we're just gonna do what we want to do.
Scott likes to call it doing nom light. But yeah, I didn't come from I don't have a ceramics degree or anything. I came from more of a sculpture background. So my discovery was like all in the studio and just learning based on random things I wanted to try, where Scott comes from a much more like academic background, which maybe had something to do with that.
Well, that's a great point too, because like, in academia, like your professor gives you all these rules in ceramics, like, oh, you can't have air bubbles, oh, it can't be 2 inches thick. It's like, that's all bullshit. And she because she didn't come from that background, she would just do it all, and I'd be like,
You're breaking the rules.
Yeah.
breaking the rules means you're gonna make discoveries, and so, you know, that was just kind of.
Well, yeah, it's funny, for so long, because I didn't come from that background, you know, I kind of resisted calling myself a potter, and so I would make forms that looked like vessels, but I would always close them in. I never wanted to have an opening. So I was like, it has no function. But then slowly I started making like vessels with openings, and it was this big thing. And I was like really kind of embarrassed to do it in the studio. It's like I made a vase.
So where's the name Nom come from?
This is another one.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, for me, it doesn't have too much like of a definition, but for
So the
Scott,
sto-
it's different.
The story behind it is, and this is, so like, whenever we would like go get food or something that, and she really liked it, she would say like, oh, nom nom nom, like delicious. And I thought it was just like something super cute that she did, and then I didn't realize it was like a thing. And then so when we were talking about a name for what our collaboration was going to be, I was like, yeah, let's just, you know, like something like nom that doesn't mean anything. And then it turns out, yeah, it's like Cookie
I was like, you know,
Monster's
it does mean something.
But yeah, so I think of it as just like kind of like delicious.
I kind of like it just because, you know, either we were gonna call ourselves Milton Proctor Ceramics, which didn't feel right, or it would be something, you know, that had some sort of deeper meaning behind it, and we just didn't want to use any words that had any sort of heavy, you know, connotation. So when he was like, do you want to just call it Nom Ceramics? I was like, yeah, sure, why not? And it's like really easy to write, you know, NOM, I like that.
And
I'm sounding so lazy.
I kind of like it too, because like in the collaboration, if it's our names and it's like, well, is this Milton? Is this Proctor? Where it's like, if it's more ambiguous, then it's like that doesn't really matter to us. It's the whole body of work that kind of shines through.
Yeah. Yep. But now, yeah, now we just kind of embrace whatever. Some people say gnome, which I kind of like that.
Or upside down is one. That happens sometimes. You're like, oh,
I know, that kind of bugs me, but whatever. So, my main focus right now is to try to kind of fill, there's like this subtle little divot here that I can see between these two halves that I would spend a lot of time kind of sweeping my finger along the inside edge there, going back and forth between that and using the serrated rib. But you can kind of see how I try to like fill that in a bit. Because that kind of bugs me, but I won't spend too much time on that. I'm gonna close it in. I'll maybe leave this serrated texture. Yeah.
They do have like wood tools that
Yeah.
you're not into that.
No, not really.
I mean,
I'll try
curious.
one. But yeah, you know, usually I fill it in enough, and then just because I know how much surface decoration I'm gonna do, like the little divots just don't, you know, I know that they're gonna disappear. So, and again, I'm kind of into the weird little imperfections that happen when I use as few tools as possible. Kind of just let my hands figure it out. But so it's getting there. You know, at this point, I think as I try to get out of the circular forms a little bit, or maybe grow from them, I think I'll try some more like teardrop things. So instead of closing it in right here, I might grow up more, you know? That's kind of what I'm thinking. So from here, you know, the form can kind of become what it what you want it to be, but for the sake of the demo, I'm gonna stick with my plan. So I kind of like to use my hand under here like as a support, and my hand is pretty much just like this, like a mold, and I'm really using a good amount of pressure, just pulling this clay inward. And I kind of bend the metal rib like that to kind of match that curved edge.
You said that for a while you didn't make vessels with openings. Do you have a way to close this up?
Yeah, so rather than getting that flat spot, you know, I would kind of get this opening super small, and then as small as I can to where just my finger can fit in, and then score that edge, and then kind of make like a little plug. So I would start with something like this, and then cut it down to where it kind of, you know, plugs like that, and then score all of that up, and then kind of smush it in and blend it.
A little cork.
Yeah, and then use a serrated rib, and that's when you get that air pocket again, where you can really rib it. Yeah, and it will do what you want. Cool, just enough clay. Okay, so I got about 1.5 coils left here, and you can see my space, my coil area got small.
So when you did close it in entirely, did you have to poke a hole to fire it though?
It's a good idea to, yeah.
Otherwise it's gone.
Yeah.
But you don't have
You don't really.
You don't have to, you break the rules.
If you fire it slow enough.
If you,
No problem.
if it's dry enough and fire slow enough, yeah. But I definitely would. There's no, you know, there's no real reason not to do that. But yes,
Blowing up part.
it's definitely a good idea to do that.
So that rule still is a real rule.
Yes. And if you let it stay a closed form for a little while, and then you poke the hole, you'll kind of hear it hiss a little bit as you open it, and that's always really satisfying.
I've done that with burning closed forms. When
Yeah.
I wanna make a litter jar, you poke it finally after you turn the gallery, and then you
Yeah. Little clay toot.
I always want to smell it. It does, it smells weird. I'm sorry, it's true that we're in the nest here, right?
We're in the nest. Okay, so now I'm kind of like really trying to move this clay as far as it'll go and make this opening pretty small. I kind of like use my palms to bring it in a bit without, like I can see some flat spots, but that's okay. So without kind of losing the roundness on top, you know. And then, of course, you could leave all this texture if you wanted to. I kind of like to rib it just, I don't know. Sometimes I do want to keep the finger marks, but it's just kind of habit. So from here, you know, I'm gonna go just one level smaller and then talk about the, like I love the really small opening in the top of a, you know, pretty wide form. Yeah.
It's a single.
It makes it feel inflated or something. So at this point, you know, all that can fit in is my index finger, and I'm just really just feeling for a seam in there and trying to squish it all together. And I can kind of start to think about forming a lip here. So now I'm kind of like pushing down with my index finger while I peel that edge up. And like at the same time, this hand is spinning the whole thing. So kind of finding that. And then, you know, from here it could grow a lot. Maybe I would leave an organic edge since the whole thing is kind of more organic. But the last thing I would do is add a really skinny coil right on this inside edge. Kind of fill that in. And voila, here we are. So, you know, I might spend some time on getting this how I want it, but you get the gist. So you can see that side happened pretty quickly. And it's pretty round. I didn't actually, most of the time I do spend a lot more time kind of sweeping from the inside out. But it really is just kind of a play of working inward and following the dimension, you know? And then kind of building vertically, but every single row you're kind of pulling inward toward the center, right? Anybody have questions?
Do you always work so fast?
No, I don't. Just during demos, I'm always like, respect the people's time. But yeah, I don't. And I kind of like to start a couple at a time, you know, make 3 bases, maybe 3 different sizes, and then kind of work in an assembly line like that. But I don't think I always work that fast. Okay. So that's pretty much how I build the form. You know, of course I would clean up the surface a bit, but y'all understand that. And if anyone wants to pick it up, you're welcome to. Probably slightly heavier than you might expect. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe not. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap this up and then we're gonna talk about underglazes a bit and a little bit of the surface decoration. So if you have any questions, you can kind of spew them out. Scott gave you a little bit of the rundown of what we do. But after I do this, I take a sip of water. Okay. Just scoot it all to the side. Okay. So, like I said, we are working with the Cone 10 soda atmosphere at our shop, Eastside Pod Shop. These 2 in particular were fired at Penland School of Craft in North Carolina. And so I also added salt to that kiln, which may or may not have had that much of a difference. It's hard to tell. So the white outline of everything is that glaze that Scott was talking about, the high feldspar Chino-like glaze that we put on. It goes on really thick on bisqued, but it looks like a slip, kind of acts like a slip. But it really fuses to the surface. And then we go back, at our shop we have, how many glazes? About like 50 glazes. Jeannie loves the glazes. And we go back and we fill in, so we kind of do a layer of drawing, and then within that we fill in with different glazes. So a single piece can have, you know, up to sometimes 20 different glazes on it. And it can get really detailed, just little bits here and there. Certain glazes we kind of like to add bright ones here and there.
So you put the Chino on before you put the other color on?
Mm-hmm. And so then we fill in, and then we go back and do a second coat of the line work glaze.
And just to clear up, it's not really a Chino.
Not quite a
If
Chino.
you use just a Chino, you're going to run into problems with layering, because Chinos don't like to be over other glazes, and so then you'd end up with crazy amount of bubbles. So it's a Chino-like glaze, but I wouldn't recommend just grabbing any
It's
old
high
Chino.
Velspar, is that what you said?
It's a glaze that's,
Magic.
I mean, it's got about 8
Kinda like
different chemicals, but it's got 3 different feldspars in it.
Yeah.
How do you apply the other glazes to it? after you-
All using these bottles, yeah. So we have a bunch of these bottles at our studio, each one with a different glaze in it. It's the same way we apply the liner. So I am not gonna show that process. I'm just gonna show, yeah, anyone's welcome to come feel. I'm just gonna talk about the underglazing, which is a new thing that I do with the white clay, yeah. So, let me just rinse it again.
Was that white clay?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was also be mixed with mica. At Penland, I went a little overboard with the surface decoration, but that was kind of my plan. But usually, I'll do like a really, like an underglaze pattern, and then I'll go over with more of a simple floral design that's kind of an overall the same pattern. So, does anybody in here fire content soda or atmospheric or Bob? So, Jenny, sorry to single you out so much. So when we're talking about high fire atmospheric settings, a lot of times underglazes don't want to exist there. Yeah. But after some trial and error and some really great online tests that I found, there are some underglazes that work well, that stay bright. These three are some of them, and two of them aren't really bright colors. So one is yellow, the other is gray, and the other is black. But there are other ones that survive, like Fire Engine Red is one by Spectrum, and a couple others, like the Amico Velvet Turquoise Blue survives, and the other yellow by Amico Velvet. I did recently switch to Spectrum for a few colors. I really do like this brand. But for my black line work, I stick with the Ultra Black by Amico Velvet. Stays super black, and it's really nice to draw with. So I apply kind of a field of color. I like to use some fan brushes. For line work, I love this guy. It switches from thick to thin, and of course, different thin one and a couple other options. And I'm gonna kind of run through this. This part I do love to kind of get in the zone and spend quite a bit of time on, but for some reason I always start with the yellow. And you know, I'm sure there are more underglazes that work. These are just the ones that I've kind of narrowed down the palette to. They work really nicely with the glazes that we use on top, which are usually different celadons, so that you can see the underglaze designs underneath. So a lot of times I'll start kind of at the top of the form, and like as it spins, I'll just kind of drag my fan brush along. I usually start just with some big sort of splotches of color. And you know, it's hard for me to remember every time, but like a lot of this is gonna get somewhat lost in the firing, so because of all the glazes on top of it. So like I don't have to be too obsessed with everything. I kind of like to really pack a bunch of underglaze on this brush and just lay it down without overthinking it too much. So with the underglaze, you want to do 2 good to 3 coats. I like to do 3 of the yellow. Sometimes with certain celadons on top of it, it'll make like a really nice neon yellow. So we use Mac Celadon is one glaze that we use. Elaine Coleman's Green Celadon, which is a mason stain based celadon, and then different like iron blue celadons. So I apply all my underglaze at bisque, as you can see. Like I said, I'm gonna move through this pretty quickly, but one thing I do like to do is a special little bit of yellow kind of around this edge. Yeah, can you rinse it? Thank you. Kind of with these forms where we have this kind of big plane, I imagine a lot of times we'll be looking down on them. So it's important to me to have a bit of every color from each perspective. Okay, then I switch to the gray. And you can look up the, you know, if you're interested in how these look in soda, the gray kind of almost looks like a raw sort of porcelain clay body in soda. It's really interesting, but it pretty much is right like they call it, a pearlescent gray. So for these ones, now I'm trying to kind of meet in between the 2 colors, and I'm still leaving some raw clay. Because again, with the soda process, you know, a lot of people use very little glaze and mostly what's called flashing slips, which are, there's slips that are made of like different clays that will flash when the soda hits it. So it'll turn like really beautiful colors and different tones. So we do try to keep a bit of raw clay exposed. And maybe I'll just lift and add some here. So kind of what this does is creates different sort of fields of color underneath the glaze. I like to think of it like different shadows and light spots. Okay. So maybe I would say, yeah, that's good. And then I like to fill in with the flashing slip. Has anyone used flashing slip before? Yes. So it is just a really thin slip that some of them can go on greenware, a lot of them go on bisque, and this brush is too big. I kind of like to fill in all the negative spaces with flashing slip, and this I would usually just do one coat. So we can kind of like decipher where the different things are on this piece, but you can see subtle tones of more like oranges peeking through, like this is all flashing slip here, and then we have a yellow background area here, some gray spots. But like, as you can see, it looks nothing like it looks in this stage, right? So this is kind of where it gets fun, is like creating almost like a coloring book for myself and just following the negative spaces. Because B-mix on its own in the soda kiln doesn't do a ton. Some clay bodies will flash a lot on their own without a flashing slip, like our shop clay body, Fig Newman. It's kind of meant for soda. So that's kind of why I do these fields of color. And then, like I said, the underglazes affect the glazes that go on top of them, so I can get some really cool things going on there. I'm not gonna spend the whole time filling in because you get the gist, but the next thing I do, switch to the black, where you can see these strokes of black happening here. And this, I try to just be really loose about it because, again, I'm never gonna really be able to decipher. But a lot of times I like to go for flowers or, organic sort of curved lines. I love this brush to get some variations in line thickness. And this kind of helps me decide what pattern to do on top. Kind of creates a movement for the eye, I feel like. So just some sort of painterly things going on. And then sometimes just like adding lines is enough to create some dimension. And then some of the last things I like to do are some good little polka dots. So every once in a while I'll find a pot and I'll see these little dots and they look really cool. So little, like, I'll go back and add little designs like that. What are y'all doing?
Showed everybody's
emails, it's fine.
Oh my goodness.
You ever find that though? Like if you're a Mac person and you jump on the opposite, you're like, what is this? Is this a computer?
Yeah, it's one or the other. So, from here is when I would go back and kind of assess the situation of what my husband's doing behind me. And then I will, this would be good. So from here is where we kind of think about the pattern that goes on top of all the underglazes and things like that. And then it becomes like a whole other surface decoration process.
That's the red that we use.
That's fire engine red. So yeah, you can see like this is all celadons, but you can see these black strokes underneath. And then it's hard to tell, but these little tiny black specks are the mica peeking through. This is a good one, yeah. So it's like underneath is this crazy, a bunch of black and yellow and gray, but it gets kind of muddled with this glaze on top of it. So
you do this field of colour underneath, and then you put the white line
yeah,
on top of this.
yes,
And then underglazes,
and
then
then
reinforce the white.
yes, and then we'll do like a bunch of little dots of glaze in between to kind of just for an extra thing. But all of these are different celadons, mostly a couple like different rutile blue. You know, I like to use some transparent glazes and some more opaque glazes, but that black underglaze really pulls through like pretty much any glaze.
This is our darker clay, our clay body from the shop.
Fig
So
Newman.
less celadons and more
Opaque, like yellow salt, chun blue, you know,
turquoise.
Oribes, things like that. But
You're not
Mhm.
bisquing again, like the
No.
other stuff you're just putting.
I do think about it because it definitely keeps the glaze from drying quickly. So the other thing we do, you know, when we put glazes in these bottles is we try to keep them kind of on the thicker side, thicker than like the glazes are at the shop in the buckets, you know, because a lot of times, especially on these big forms, like I'm working like this, or I'll be sitting and kind of bring it in my lap and work like this, and it's just dripping, you know, if it's too thin. So it's all thinking about how to fight gravity.
Oh, here's an interesting one, because this is mostly just flash and slip.
Yeah, so this one is B-mix with mica, little specks, but no drawing, it's just flashing slip and then a bunch of dots of glaze. And the spoon is just B-mix on its own.
Do you know what glazes you're gonna use on a particular piece before you start? Do you sort of lay out your palette, or is it just?
Yeah, I do. Well, it kind of, you know, the first thing to think about is the clay. So if I'm using the white clay body and the underglazes, I definitely have like the 5 celadons and then a couple extra glazes that I'll throw in there. But yeah, more or less. And pretty much every piece has the same glazes on them, you know, about 10 to 20 different glazes. But there's like my favorite 10 that I make sure I get on every piece. No, I'm just kidding. Not on every like cup, that would be a lot, but on the bigger ones, yeah.
Where do you market your work? Where do you sell it?
We sell at Companion Gallery online. We sell on our own website. Clayfest is a big one for us. Charlie Cummings, Clay Acar, the one up in Iowa, yeah. Yeah.
So to add on to that, for you know, there are opportunities with these galleries that she's mentioning that they have open calls where you can just submit work, and they don't just do it for the $45 application fee. There's usually no application fee, which is really nice.
Yeah, it's true.
And if you don't mind me speaking about it, you know, it was great. It's like Renee Lopresti, who's at the Eye of the Dog. I'm sure all of you know her work because it's wonderful. We started firing with her, and she introduced us to the people at Companion Gallery, and they asked us to show with them. And then, you know, as the work evolved and we started showing with these galleries, it led to more galleries. And so, like she said, that's primarily where we sell, and we love Texas Clay Fest. That's our favorite.
That's our favorite one. And yeah, Companion Gallery, every year they do a show called Material Mugs, and it's like they ask you to incorporate a specific material into your work. And one year, or I'm not sure if it's every year, they did underglaze, and this is when we were only using a dark stoneware. So they asked us to do underglaze. We had never used it before. That's when we switched, we tried B-mix, and so ever since then, like the work has just expanded so much. So if it wasn't for them, you know, it would be a lot darker, I guess, I don't know. But yeah, so that's the gist of that. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for putting this together. I'm happy to be here with GACA. Yeah. Anybody got any questions? No? That's okay.
I wanted to know if you have problems with dripping sometimes.
In the kiln? So the biggest thing, like this glaze, the line work glaze really holds the glazes in. So toward the bottom, I just make sure that there's no other glaze that doesn't have that glaze holding it in, you know. But yes, sometimes we do have dripping problems.
And there's certain glazes where like, we know they drip and we're like, are you crazy? You put that at the bottom?
Yeah. And then we spend a lot of time grinding the bottom.
I mean,
So yes, we do have that.
and it's, you know, a lot of people don't know it when they soda fire that literally every single piece we pull out of the soda kiln, there's some level of cleanup, grinding, sanding, smoothing, sometimes a whole bunch of it. I mean, we've had pieces where we've had a half an hour, 40 minutes of actual cleanup on the bottom. But our students oftentimes freak out and think it's like a bad thing, but like with wood firing and soda firing, it's kind of just part of the process. And we've figured out ways to sort of minimize it, but it's definitely part of it. So not everything just comes out like
Super
ready
clean.
to go on the shelf. It's like, you know.
Because everything is lifted up on wadding, you know, to separate it from the shelf.
Oh, that is a glaze those are microcrystals. So slow cooling in that glaze in particular. Yeah. But the flashing slip on this one is all this orange.
Since I haven't ever done soda firing, how long does it take once you start the process until you can get your item out? Is like days?
So it depends, but in our kiln, it fires for about 12 hours, and then it'll cool for 12 hours. So we can unload it the day after we fire it.
Okay.
But it kind of depends on what the kiln is made of. Like, we have a soft brick kiln, which means it cools pretty quickly. At Penland, it was all hard brick kiln, so it took a couple of days for it to be cool enough before I could unload it.
I don't think I know. I was gonna say, I had pictures of you firing the kiln at Penland, but I don't have it on this computer.
That was so fun. Yeah. If anyone has the opportunity to go out to North Carolina, Penland School of Craft is really awesome. Good place.
All right, well,
Thanks, y'all.
yeah, feel free to come up and ask more questions if you need to while they kind of clean up and everything. Thanks y'all for coming. Like I
did
said,
have some questions, but I didn't realize
I know, we're a big group. Take her up on it.
very small.
First come, first serve.
I'm just so delighted to see so many new people. So
If you need to pay dues
Thanks, Chica. Wow.
still, that's Bob over there, Coffee Can Accountant. If you need to fill out the membership form or you're interested in joining, you're welcome to talk to me. Yeah, I'll be putting out information about our February meeting. Like I said, I don't know my phone's recording. I think it's on the 7th, whatever the first Tuesday is. And yeah, if you are interested in helping out with GACA at all this year, as far as advisory committee, or if you're interested in helping with the studio tour, please contact me, because I would appreciate help. All right, night.